is throwing some rabbit tracks before me, but I'm more than happy to talk to them and take my time because I know I probably still have a good, half hour to 40 minutes to discuss this. So, Mr. Speaker, Monsieur le Président, je suis plus que acceptant de faire un discours en français si j'ai besoin. Mais sur celui-ci, je n'ai pas le besoin de faire une discussion sur le projet de loi 114. And I'll save the rest for you, Mr. Speaker, because I know that I know the minister. You'd have to follow the Minister of Finance in this particular case to ensure. And Mr. Speaker, that would be a wonderful discussion as well to talk about in the House is simultaneous translation when we're able to do it. But Mr. Speaker, Bill 114, our feeling is it doesn't have a lot to offer, and we should be talking about more important things. Doesn't have anything to offer at all. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my seat because I've got time to spend in law amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I was pleased to say a few words today on Bill 114, which seems to be an act that's requiring a policy, an act that requires a policy, it says, for the government of Nova Scotia and public passenger vehicles. And Mr. Speaker, when we looked at this act, again, this is something that did not require a piece of legislation here in the House. And one of the recent bills that I'd spoken on, very similar to that, was the one, the Police Act changes coming under the Department of Justice, which called for a small little policy change from the Department of Justice to directive really to the police forces of Nova Scotia. Again, something that could have been done easily within the powers of the Justice Minister to simply send a note to the police departments and say, this is a directive from my office. Here again, we have an entire act that even says in its title, it's an act to require an anti-idling policy. I think it's almost ludicrous, really, that we're at a point where we're looking at ideas and changes to our province that are so trifling. Now, idling is not trifling, and that's something you could deal with without any hours of debate, without putting it through 3 readings, without going to law amendments, because there is a widespread support among the public that we curb idling, that we not add to greenhouse gases, that we not waste government resources in terms of wasted gas and so on from our fleet sitting around idling and disturbing neighbourhoods with the noise and with the pollution. So we accept that of course the public knows it's the wrong thing to do. And that, as has been pointed out, schools in particular have taken a lead on this, but schools across the province have made anti-idling rules on their own properties and around the school for over the last 10 years. We had a letter actually received today from a school in the Valley from a teacher who said 10 years ago they had addressed this issue at their school. And we know that there's been a movement afoot that was begun by a young girl in the metro area who started one, which is the car-free idling zones around schools. And almost every school I can think of has adopted that, right up to the school board level when it became so popular that they agreed, absolutely, you should not be sitting in front of a school idling and basically creating a pollution and you know, foul air essentially for the kids in that school. In fact, in the past, sometimes cars would idle right near the intake valves where clean air is supposed to be brought into the school, and of course create health and safety issues within that school for the students and the teachers and staff. So, you know, this is something that is well established and well accepted by the public. So we have no problem with the idea that you want to curb idling, and that, of course, the government should have a stance and should have, in fact, years ago told the operators of their fleet and the operators of government-owned vehicles that we don't tolerate idling, and that they are to curb that, to make sure that there's a time limit on how long they can run their buses or their trucks and so on. And we know there are many vehicles that are operated by the province of Nova Scotia, and so that should have been done. And the very fact that we're here having any debate and any discussion from each party speaking about how they feel on this bill, it just really does fly in the face of good governance, Mr. Speaker, because good governance would have been that you saw a problem and you made a policy change and it was enacted, just acted upon. You don't need to come here for something like this, because this is already accepted by the public, accepted by members of the opposition, and this is a very immaterial act as it stands. I mean, as it stands, according to this act, it's not even that there is a policy available now. It gives you another year to come up with a new act or a new policy that you'd put in place for all of your fleets. And I guess it will cover a few that are in the public or private sector if they're running transit vehicles and things like that. So there are a little bit of other groups that will be captured in this. But as the previous member who was just speaking from Argyll, he actually drew our attention to today's editorial in the newspaper, which does in fact say this is unnecessary and not very important. In fact, the title of that is redundant legislation. That's a little bit nicer than my saying it's ludicrous or it's trifling, but it is redundant because it is very tiny, and it's something that one of those ministers over there could have easily ordered. I don't know which one, but one of the ministers has the power to do that, probably transportation and infrastructure, or because he covers environment as well, and he's got lots of cars in his fleet, lots of trucks on the road. But Mr. Speaker, we feel that in so many ways, the legislation before us in this session, and I am referring directly to Bill 114, we just feel that so many of these bills are of a very minor nature, and that the issues before us on the environmental front or on air pollution, on the husbanding of our resources, because you know if you idle a car, you use up a tremendous amount of gas, and then those vehicles have to be filled up again. We know that that's causes greenhouse gases. We know it's a declining resource. We know the cost of petroleum is rising. So there are at least those three wonderful reasons to curb idling right there. And yet here we are, with a bill that isn't addressing a major overall of anything. It's such a tiny, tiny part of the concerns before us, and could have been dealt with much more expeditiously. That's really what we're saying. Where ministers have powers that they're granted in their acts, they should be using those powers and not bringing a lot of legislation here, which takes our eye off the bigger issues that are before us. And Mr. Speaker, I think that having a suburban task force, as we seem to have, or a team that are going to work on issues, is just dandy. But the issues that, if in fact this is one of them that have come from that team, are not exclusive to suburbs or cities or rural Nova Scotia. They're important to everybody. And they're certainly important in the heart of the city, just as much as they are in the outlying areas of any one of our towns and cities. So, it seems to me that we're off track here on this session of the legislature. And Mr. Speaker, I know that we will be able to add up a list of these bills that have been 1 and 2 clauses, that once you get past the definitions, I thought this one was actually a little longer because it did actually go for 1 line onto the 2nd page. But when you look at it, Mr. Speaker, it's all definitions. So really the large part of it is just defining exactly what is a public passenger vehicle and what does a tour bus mean and so on. And that can run into a few words. So there we are actually able to get beyond the 1st page barely. There is so little meat on the bones here that, it invites members of the opposition to go into flights of fancy, as I understand we'd had a bit of last night, to speak about many other issues that are far more pressing to us and in our communities. And what I'd like to see is that this would have been done, that we would have had an announcement that it was done, and not that we would go through a legislative process that isn't necessary. And I'll go so far as to suggest, Mr. Speaker, that what we're seeing here today, and in this whole session with these minor bills, is really a government that spent so much time in opposition with little 1-clause bills, making, their small points through the only tool they had available, because they were very adept at using the few tools they had available in opposition. One of those tools is a private member's bill. That's a way for us to say, you're not acting on something, and we'd like you to look at it. And that's why in opposition, we might add small bills forward that are of, a single nature. We don't have the resources in opposition to do all of the full-blown work that would be involved in overhauling a complete act. So we might pick a tiny or small piece of it and say, that's something we think you should address. Mr. Speaker, I've done that on a number of occasions with residential tenancies and other issues where I didn't have the resources to say how we would overhaul the entire Residential Tenancies Act, but I knew there were problems with it and that we needed to address them, and I brought up the problems that had come up in my community about them. But when you're in government and you have entire departments at your disposal and a large number of policy and legal people and researchers, you have the resources to do substantive acts. And over here in opposition, we're looking for those acts. We want to see where the brain trust is, where the ideas are, how you're going to mold or change this province. And it's not obvious from the now lengthening list of small and very almost immaterial suggestions coming from government. And, you know, and frankly, I'm disappointed, and I know that there are a lot of Nova Scotians that are disappointed by those kind of behavior, really, that the government, you know, who have now had more than a year to get settled and understand your resources and understand the power of your ministries and staff, are still bringing forward such small and insignificant ideas that you should have taken the pen and written a letter and sent out the directive to the people under you, and it would have been done. And these are not things that opposition are going to object to, clearly. You know, again, the ministers over there are often saying in question period, well, call me and we'll tell you whether you know, we'll work with you. Have a meeting, give us a call. You know, your job in opposition is to call the ministers. Well, by the same token, you can call us. You would know there's no objection to a law that would create a policy that hopefully would decrease idling in our province. You know, there's nothing that is going to be objectionable in this act. Act Bill 114. So if you were concerned about it needing this legislative authority, I think that could have been determined very quickly, that it could be done with our blessing, and the opposition would have said, that's good, go ahead, do it, and the sooner the better. That's what I would have said, and I know our critic for the environment would have said, do it, it's a good thing. Companies are ahead of us, bus companies are ahead of us. There's already, as the editorial said today in the paper, Metro Transit already had a policy to tell their drivers not to idle for more than 3 minutes, where the actual riders on Metro Transit have been known to report drivers who are idling beyond that. And I know in my neighborhood, Mr. Speaker, there's some controversy around where they're going to place the next bus. I guess it's like a terminal, a bus terminal. They're replacing the Lacewood terminal. They want more room. And the controversy has been around putting it too close to residential homes and apartments because of the air quality. And one of the complaints has been the fact that cars or those big buses will be in there idling and fouling the air around there. So that this is close, particularly to apartment buildings, the one that the site that's being looked at now. And that means a lot of people could be impacted. So we know, my point is, we know that Metro Transit's answer was we have an anti-idling policy. So don't worry, we're going to still put it near your apartments and homes, but we will be cognizant of the impact of idling, and we've told our drivers they're not to idle for any length of time. It was mentioned again in the editorial today that the Chignecto Central Regional School Board put in a policy. They in fact invested in a pre-warming system for its fleet of buses so that the buses would not have to idle, each individually idling for a long time to warm up. So they put money behind their suggestion. And Mr. Speaker, you know, really when we're talking about idling, and as I said, we should hats off to the school boards and the individual schools and the students that have made this an issue around the province. I think they've done a tremendous job in educating their families, educating their parents. I would also say we should look as well to Kings County, that did bring in not only an anti-idling, but actually had some restrictions on drive-throughs. Now, I know they're a smaller county. Maybe it would have affected some businesses, but I think that they took it a step further. And although the one of our previous speakers from the Conservative caucus suggested that would be almost a sacrilege to look at drive-throughs, I think Nova Scotians are farther ahead than many members of the legislature. And I think that a lot of people, although they use drive-throughs, would understand why, again, it is not healthy. It's a waste of resources. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for greenhouse gases. It's bad for our waistlines, Mr. Speaker. If I can go back to my health portfolio, which I am the critic for, we need to be active. We need to move, and sitting in our cars and going through drive-thrus is not the way we're going to achieve that. And so I would suggest that we need as many measures as we can that keep people moving around and using our faculties, because if we don't keep ourselves fit, we know darn well the health system can't afford the coming cost of aging Nova Scotians and large number of seniors that are coming along that are not getting adequate amount of exercise. Mr. Speaker, just last night in my community, I had a town hall meeting on wellness, and I think this subject of Bill number 114 would have fit in very nicely in that town hall, because we were talking about ways to keep people a little bit more active, a little bit more fit, and we talked a lot about the opportunities in our own neighborhoods. In Clayton Park, we're very lucky that we have the new Canada Games Centre about to open, but a lot of the discussion was centered around the Heart and Stroke Foundation, who talk about simply getting out and walking and using our faculties and our abilities before you lose them. So I think that there is something to be said for the councillors of Kings County who took a very bold move. And at least when you put a bold move on the table, there's something to discuss. But with this Bill 114, there is nothing bold or interesting that really deserves a great deal of debate. Of course, the members in government will know that when you put a bill before us, it does invite us to speak on other areas that we think are very important, both to say that we support elements of a bill, but also to point out related elements that are not being acted on, or things that have been missed. And an omission is something we're seeing a lot of when we're looking at one-clause bills and bills with very little meat in them, quite frankly. And I'm sure that anybody who's been around the legislature for long would attest that I don't think we've seen another session with such small bills, one-clause bills, moving their way through. They can't even be called housekeeping. We are used to a lot of housekeeping bills. I know when the Tories were in a minority situation, for the first 6 years that I sat in the House, Mr. Speaker, we did see a lot of that because, again, in a minority situation, you don't want to have a lot of controversy and you're trying very hard to steer a course that's not going to topple your government. So there was definitely many years of cautious legislation and an attempt to get more support and to make little small changes that would cause nobody any problems. And that was really what we were seeing, Mr. Speaker, for that period of time, was a cautious, steady as she goes government. But now we have a majority government, and we're seeing bills that don't even need to be legislation. This has got to be nothing more than a number count. And I'm just looking forward to that press release that comes out from the government, patting yourselves on the back for passing a whole bunch of bills that didn't even need to be brought here, that you could have done in any month of the year on your own through your ministries, and also announced them and counted them as a success. Because Bill 114, if we ever get that policy, hopefully it won't take till next October, but if we get the policy in place, I'm sure that will be a positive thing for our province. I would just say to you, why don't we have a policy already? It's the job of the departments to do that. It's the job of government to see that we're acting responsibly and that your fleet of vehicles is being run as economically and in as healthy a way as possible. So why are we even here today, allowing this to take time as it works its way through the legislature? Why isn't somebody right now writing that policy, and why isn't it out there in the public and in the hands of the people who are running your vehicles and fleets? That's really what I think, Mr. Speaker. I think that this is in many ways just vexatious almost, taking the time of the legislature to look at bills that do not have the substance that should be here in front of the legislature, that are not going to change the course of our success as a province. This is the thing that we're looking for, is where are the changes that are going to strengthen our province? Why aren't we debating those kind of things that are going to make us a stronger, more prosperous province to live in? And that is exactly what I know all of us have come here for, is to try and make a difference. And I just think that these things are things that any minister would be responsible for and should have had in place to begin with. Mr. Speaker, I think there are other ways the government could be helping in terms of the environment and in terms of the fleet of vehicles that they have. And I had taken the opportunity of writing to the Minister of Finance about one idea that I think has more merit and would relate to probably the use of vehicles and how much cost there is involved in that, in both the ownership and the operation of vehicles. And that idea was the car share FX, that HFX, I guess it is, car share Halifax, which has been recognized several times. It's a new company in the last couple of years. The owner and I guess, entrepreneur that started that has been recognized here by Mr. I won't say his name, I'm sorry, by the member from Halifax, Citadel, Sable Island, and by myself. Last year, the woman who started that company, Pam Cooley, won a Halifax Business Award as the best startup company. She's been recognized this year as one of the by the Canadian Progress Club as one of the Women of Excellence Awards for recipients for this year. And again, for her work, which is both environmental and entrepreneurial. And she took an idea that's been successful in other cities like Vancouver and American cities, Seattle and so on, and has brought that idea to Nova Scotia. And her difficulty is that the government of Nova Scotia, when they tender for vehicles that we want to use in our fleets, like we will be having a policy for in Bill 114, those vehicle tenders are to either purchase new vehicles or they are to rent vehicles. So we have car rental contracts and standing order, I guess, I think they go on a list, a preferred list of companies we go to, but we don't have a category that would address a company that's new and innovative like Car Share Halifax. That requires, and I don't know if you're aware of it, Mr. Speaker, about what that exactly is about, but that is an organization that a group like Capital Health, for example, could join, and then their employees are able to go and access a vehicle that's parked nearby in a handy location, and they share it with other users. And you book the use of that vehicle and you pay an annual fee to belong and an hourly fee to use it. But you don't pay insurance, you don't pay the gasoline costs, you don't pay maintenance or repairs. It's ready to roll when you step into it. And I think there'd be a real benefit to the province of Nova Scotia, at least in some of our uses and in some of our departments, to be a part of that, or a supporter, really, to join that, because it's a membership-based concept. We should be members. And I think it's a financial issue as much as it is an environmental issue, and that's why I wrote to the Minister of Finance, because he is the neighboring MLA in my riding, to my riding, and I knew that he would appreciate the benefit of this, because I believe he was the first of our members to have a hybrid and to recognize the value of social responsibility when it comes to driving and the kind of cars we drive. So, Mr. Speaker, I felt he would be receptive not only on an environmental level, but also on a financial level. Because if this can save the province of Nova Scotia money, that's a pretty significant thing. Now, right now, this anti-idling bill, this may save us some money, but why aren't we already doing it? The money we would be saving here would be the gas that's going up, just burning up and causing greenhouse gases, not carrying anybody anywhere. And there is a cost to that. So this should have been done already if we're serious about saving money. And the Minister of Finance might look at how else we can save money by perhaps decreasing our fleet and making use of what is an innovative concept that has taken root in other cities with the support of municipal and provincial and other levels of government who can actually subscribe to it, become members and support it. And I don't believe that we are doing that here in Nova Scotia. Now, it's been some months since I spoke to the owner of Car Share Halifax, so maybe things have loosened up. Perhaps there's been a little bit more receptiveness, but I do know that the tendering process was a problem. And it's because there is no category in which they can sort of add their name and say, include us, consider us in that. And I noticed the Minister of the Environment is very interested in this too, and I can see why. I hope that you received the correspondence from the Minister of Finance, because I was told that it was sent to you instead. I believe it's of interest to both ministries. I honestly do. And I think that we could all play a role by looking at where our fleets could be minimized or decreased, and how we could just even give this a try. Now, that would be something innovative, that if we could help some new concept in car ownership go forward in our province. And I know that there'd be a demand for that in my own riding, and that people would want to subscribe to that. Because in my riding, we have high density and a lot of people living close, a fairly close area to each other. And I know there'd be enough people that would subscribe to that, that we could actually support some of those cars in Clayton Park. We have the most highly densely populated riding in the entire province, in the Clayton Park area. But when I approached the owner of Car Share Halifax, I was told they have to get a good founding and a good foothold in their current area, which is the peninsula. And that's certainly in the backyard of where most of our government business is taking place. So, Mr. Speaker, I only mention that because that would have a more material impact in this province. And again, it doesn't require a bill. I'd like to caution the government, they don't need a bill to do this. They just need a will to sit down and pay attention. Just pay attention to some of the opportunities that are there that are small. Not everything that is small is immaterial. Sometimes it can be small and significant. And I'm saying, why don't you look at those things? Why don't you try to champion those things rather than being about 10 years behind the school boards of the province and individual boards? Certainly the Valley Board, I said, had schools that were 10 years ahead of us on this measure. And why, rather than being a follower and way behind the trend, why not get out ahead of some of these things? Show us some of that zeal that might have been a little more evident when you were here in opposition. I think the zeal's gone out of you. It's gone. I'd like to, it's gone, yeah, it's idling. That's right. You know, we just are looking for something with a little bit more substance that we could say, yes, that we're on a track where Nova Scotia is doing some new things, supporting and partnering with innovative entrepreneurs, people who are willing to take a chance on our province. You know, where the government could make a difference is by maybe changing some of those habits you have around the size of the fleet, the type of vehicles we're running, why we own the vehicles we own, and looking to see whether there's a way to substitute that or reduce that. That would be part of decreasing the government's footprint as well. And so I would say let's see some of those bigger ideas coming forward. And in the meantime, I mean, I can be pretty sure, I guess I shouldn't presume, but I can't imagine that a bill like Bill 114 is going to create much interest at law amendments. But again, nobody objects to Bill 114. We just think, why haven't you already done it? Why is it here before us today? The idea of curbing idling at anywhere with our public vehicles, our transit vehicles, and so on should already have been done. And as we can see from today's editorial in the Herald, they found the examples of where it already is done. So I would just say that this is again a bill that is very, very much behind and slow, really, to react to public action already. And so I don't really see why we have before us a bill that is going to take time as it works its way through. And I just want to remind the government, Mr. Speaker, that this will be included in our list of bills that are really not going to make any real difference in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to allow the honourable member for Digby Annapolis to have for an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member from Clayton Park too. I didn't want to disturb her. She was on quite a roll there, so it was good. But I'd like to bring the member's attention to the West Gallery. There's a person up there who's put up with me for 38 years, and I don't know whether you'd want to give her a warm welcome or your deepest sympathy, but I would like for you all to meet my wife and give her a wonderful applause.
Thank you. We always welcome family members here. We're always glad to see them for sure. So with that, I'll recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure perhaps the honourable member for Digby Annapolis had his wife come to town. The first lobsters are on the dock by now. So you know, maybe we're looking forward to lobsters here later today. Anyway, no, I'm pleased to stand and speak to Bill 114, as we know, an easy bill to support. But again, it's unfortunate in many ways that we have to take time in the House to deal with a bill. We have areas of the province that are literally miles ahead when it comes to anti-idling. We have school boards that, in fact, have had this policy now because as a school administrator, I was actually asked 10 years ago, we had anti-idling at our school. And sometimes I would be asked by the bus director for the board, just step outside occasionally, run a check, and make sure all the buses are turned off while they're waiting for students. So this is a bill that has less and less relevance to today. In fact, what the Minister of the Environment, should have really been doing is sending out good, solid educational information to all the boards, that perhaps don't practice as strongly as AVR SB, to companies that have large numbers of employees, to the whole range of government departments. This would have been a real good directive coming from the Minister of the Environment. So I was hoping for more significant announcements from the NDP around environmental issues. In fact, it was just on the weekend that I heard from a constituent of the member for Kings North, and he said, much as I've said so far, that this should have been a directive. This should have simply been a common sense theme that should be constantly there, constantly reminded. And of course, I was delighted to see that, yes, for 18 months, the NDP government has been on idle because he did sign off ex-NDPer. And so he is very dissatisfied with the way the environmental issues have been handled by this government. And in fact, we know the town of Wolfville, Kings County generally. In fact, Councillor Wayne Atwater has talked about this. He's led a charge even at Tim Hortons. Now, Tim Hortons is a place where it's hard to get people not to idle their vehicles. But it's amazing with a little promotion. Get out there in the newspaper, get in the media about the benefits of not idling your car in relation to a cleaner local environment. But again, the savings, and the minister's right, there are savings here on fuel. There, in fact, is indeed savings in terms of reduction of carbon into the atmosphere, the things that we need as all citizens need to be cognizant of. This is one of those areas that I think from time to time we miss a golden opportunity to put a simple little statement to promote anti-idling in the Nova Scotia power bills. The Nova Scotia power bill goes out to 455,000 people each month or every other month, depending on the program that you are enrolled in. And so there's a great opportunity to promote real significant advances, whether it's on the idling, energy conservation, I like to see that kind of thing done. It can be done on a once a year or a couple of times a year to get a central message out. Now I was hoping that in the first 18 months of the NDP term that we'd see something significant around public transit. Because again, I know in the Annapolis Valley the kind of advances that King's Transit has made. They have done a marvelous job in running a service from the eastern part of the county, in fact, down into Digby County. And I know how significant it is for the call center in Cornwallis. Rather than have, another 50 vehicles going in there every day, King's Transit pulls in. And they make several runs a day because of the staggered nature of the shifts that go on at that plant. Now, transit can improve right across Nova Scotia, but we know that, in fact, we're hearing there's been some slippage here in the HRM. So this is an area where, again, with a few initiatives from government, we can see some uptake and increase ridership, keep some of the vehicles off the road so they won't even be, have to worry about not idling. And as an educator, I like to see a stronger educative piece around this issue with young Nova Scotians. Through our education system, there are ways to get this message out that can be cemented for the next generation. When you have 133,000 students, roughly, in our system, to find ways that we can speak to them about the importance of not idling a vehicle. I think, again, those messages become imprinted, they become part of just the way they will exercise, and especially those that are in senior high, because really now, from grade 10 on, there are students with their license, and they can start good practices in their communities. So I think some of real opportunity around this particular issue, while it may be seen as not that significant, I see it as significant, but I see it as not needing a bill to come before the legislature. In fact, we can promote good policy out of our departments without having to bring it to the legislature. Here we are talking about reducing idling in Nova Scotia at all kinds of sites, and yet we're going to allow a constant level of mercury emissions for the next 4 years. All done, of course, in the name of saying we're going to keep power rates down. Well, 7.5% increase coming in January doesn't sound like we've achieved very much in that regard. And we're also going to get the mercury emissions spewing from Point Coney and Lingan. So again, this is not what a traditional NDP government would be working towards. This is not the kind of environmental goals that I often heard, expounded when they were on this side of the House. So this bill, really comes at I think, a very, very poor time as well. It's a little better than the clothesline bill, because that was done as an act of appeasement. But at the same time, we have some monumental issues in our province that we should be addressing here in the House. When you get a report like one of the ones we had last week, which talked about 14,000 children in Nova Scotia that live in poverty. You know, we should be really literally going around asking all 52 members what are some measures that can be taken to reduce poverty with that many children in our province. It's a huge issue. I know what poverty does to children. You know, I had them there in front of me for almost 30 years. And you know, we haven't made, again, the kind of strides that we had expected, you know, from this government, because before they took government, in fact, I was in rallies with many of my NDP friends in the Valley as part of, you know, a public awareness, a public education, especially, of course, in Berwick, where we've had a very, very strong movement for now about 12 years with the Feed My Lambs program. And so, you know, that's the kind of thing that we're not seeing translated now on the larger stage. Some good initiatives that take place, again, at the local level. And you know, I think when we look at a time when, you know, jobs aren't being lost by 5 or 10, they're being lost by, you know, 100, 200, 300, and so forth. I think, you know, the idling bill is pretty small stuff, a small, important step, but pretty small in relation to the kind of major issues that we face here in our province. And I think there are probably a couple of others that may like to speak to this bill, and perhaps maybe the minister will decide on doing more on public policy. This bill will of course pass through the legislature, but again, without a strong education component, it's not going to have the real value that the intent is here. And there are already great models that exist across Nova Scotia. We need to look at the model communities, the model you know, school boards, the model industries, the model businesses, and say we're going to have them as the leaders to institute a province-wide anti-idling program. So with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I will take my place.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I'll now recognize the Honourable Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to be very brief with my remarks on this topic. It's a very important topic, and like my honourable colleagues have said before me, this is not an issue that really had to come to the legislature in the form of a bill. The Premier and his cabinet could very easily issue a directive to all government employees: don't idle your vehicles. That simple. Could have been done. It could be done any day, and we'll move it forward and put some penalties in place for staff that don't follow through. But I don't think the penalties would be necessary. I think that the staff and the employees that work for the civil service are very aware of the environment, and indeed, with even a suggestion from the government that indeed that's a policy we'd like to move forward, that indeed they would do that. I have a great faith in the civil service we have in this province, and I know they have the best interests of Nova Scotians at heart. So it's so simple to change this. We spent a lot of time debating a bill here that really doesn't do anything. It's another bill to rack up the count for the NDP to make sure they get more bills, and I don't know who, but anyway, they rack these bills up, and indeed it's a bill, if they're going to put legislation in place, make it a law for everybody. So you don't idle, and indeed, hopefully people will stop idling their vehicles more and more. I know at a recent traffic stop on a construction site here this summer, it stopped for quite a while while the traffic was moving from the other direction. And I noted that I immediately shut my vehicle off, as they do all the time at a site like that. But I noticed all the cars ahead of me and behind me that I could see did the same thing, and did it almost as soon as they stopped. And I think that's an indication where Nova Scotians are thinking and moving forward. And I encourage anyone out there to, indeed, if they possibly can, shut their vehicle off and stop the emissions that are coming out of the vehicles, and also save energy in the province and the greenhouse gas problem. So with those few words, I will take my place, and hopefully the government will bring more substantive legislation forward in the future, things that really will help our Nova Scotia economy and indeed our environment. Thank you.
Thank you, honourable member. The honourable member of the environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all the members opposite for their engagement in this particular topic, and I want to move second reading of Bill 114. Thank you.
Question's been called. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 114, an act to require an anti-idling policy for the Government of Nova Scotia and public passenger vehicles.
Order this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 115, the Public Sector Compensation Disclosure Act?
Bill number 115. I'll recognize the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill 115, the Public Sector Compensation Disclosure Act. Mr. Speaker, we have made a commitment to be more open and accountable about the operations of government. We have followed through on that commitment. In this sitting alone, we have introduced a new Auditor General Act and a new Conflict of Interest Act, as well as the Public Interest Disclosure of Wrongdoing Act that was introduced yesterday, and the amendments to the Lobbyist Registration Act introduced today. This bill, the Public Sector Compensation Disclosure Act, fits with this theme. Bill 115 is very similar to legislation already in place in Ontario, Manitoba, and British Columbia. The purpose of this legislation is to expand reporting about compensation paid by the public sector. This will make it easier, much easier, for taxpayers to see where their money is going and to judge for themselves whether the compensation is reasonable. A sensible conversation about public sector compensation levels requires, as a first step, that the compensation levels be disclosed. As the House will know, a detailed annual listing of the salaries and expenses of government employees has for many years been made public as Volume 3 of the Public Accounts. As Section 8 of this bill makes clear, that disclosure will continue. Everything in this bill is in addition to the disclosure that already occurs in the public accounts. Mr. Speaker, this legislation requires at least 100 additional public sector bodies to report annually if they pay compensation of $100,000 or more to anyone who works for them or who otherwise receives compensation from them directly or indirectly and in any form. Mr. Speaker, there are three parts to the definition of public sector body that will be covered by this Act. The first part includes any body that is within the government reporting entity, which in the happy jargon of the Department of Finance is known as the GRE, as defined by the Finance Act. The full list of bodies that is included in the GRE is in Schedule 10 of Volume 1 of the Public Accounts. It includes, among others, all school boards and all district health authorities. That list is available online, and of course, I'd be happy to provide a hard copy to any member who wishes to see it. The second part of the definition includes any person, organization, or body designated by regulation. This allows the list of entities to be flexible and to grow or contract as circumstances require without requiring a statutory amendment. Mr. Speaker, I can inform the House that it is the intention of the government to enact such a regulation to cover universities and colleges. They are not part of the government reporting entity, so if they are to be included, and it is the government's intention that they will be included, it must be done by way of regulation. The third part of the definition includes non-profit organizations that receive a substantial amount of funding from the government. Mr. Speaker, since the bill was tabled last Friday, there have been some questions and perhaps a little bit of incorrect or ambiguous information in the media about whether this legislation applies to payments to physicians. It is to be expected that there might be some uncertainty on this point because payments to physicians is a complicated subject. That's because there are several different sources of possible compensation to physicians, and any given physician may receive compensation from one or a few or all of these sources. Mr. Speaker, I would note in passing that in Manitoba, their law applies only to fee-for-service payments. In Ontario, the law applies only to physicians who are direct employees. In British Columbia, the law applies to all payments to physicians. Because of the possible uncertainty, I wish to inform the House of the government's intention on this point. The bill, as written, will apply to any physician who is directly employed by a public sector body, such as the Department of Health or a district health authority, or who, under any other arrangement, receives direct payment from a public sector body. Once the regulation is passed to include universities, as I have previously discussed, the disclosure will also include compensation from a university, the most obvious such compensation being from the Dalhousie Medical School. Mr. Speaker, fee-for-service payments are not currently automatically covered by the bill, but the regulation-making authority is intentionally broad enough to permit disclosure of such payments in future if the appropriate regulation is enacted. In fact, the regulation-making authority is intentionally broad enough to include compensation paid under any statute or regulation to ensure that disclosure is as thorough as possible and that taxpayers can see where their money is going. Mr. Speaker, I turn now from who is covered to what is covered. The overall threshold we have selected for disclosure is $100,000, the same threshold as Ontario. I think most people would agree that public interest is focused on the upper end of the salary scale. The current threshold of $25,000 in Volume 3 of the public accounts was set many years ago and is probably too low. I want to reiterate that we are not going to change the public accounts threshold, but for purposes of this Act, a higher threshold was in order. The challenge is to select a threshold that provides meaningful disclosure without adding an unmanageable or unreasonable administrative burden that outweighs the benefit of disclosure. Mr. Speaker, that is why we have selected $100,000. The first mandatory report under this Act will be for the 2011-2012 fiscal year. Each public sector body must produce its report within 6 months of the fiscal year end. In other words, the very latest report under this Act will be on September 30th, 2012, and then every September 30th after that. However, some bodies will be ready to report before the statutory deadline, and Section 3 makes clear that they are free to publish their report whenever they are ready, and we encourage them to do so. Section 4 lays out how the information is to be published. The statement required by this new law must be included in the audited financial statements or in another statement prepared for purposes of this Act and certified correct by the entity's auditor. This statement must then be posted to a publicly available website. We know that there is a tremendous variety of organizational structures and payment arrangements in the broader public sector, And so some time will be needed to work out exactly how this new reporting regime will work for at least some of the entities captured by this legislation. There is plenty of time to consult with all public bodies on exactly what their new obligations will be, and we are happy to do that. The essential point, Mr. Speaker, is that this bill represents definite government policy, and so any discussion with public sector bodies will be about how we implement it, not whether we implement it. Mr. Speaker, more information about compensation means more transparency and more accountability. We know that these new disclosure rules will work because they, or some close variation of them, are already in place in Ontario, Manitoba, and British Columbia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. I'll now recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to speak on Bill 115, Public Sector Compensation Disclosure Act. And as has already been mentioned in a number of circles, it is a good step forward towards greater transparency, as it will allow disclosure of compensation of salaries where public money is spent. Now, the deficiency that I can see right off with this bill is that it does not include the expenses. There are some expenses that will be included, but it doesn't require every item that could be in an expense account. Bonuses are often separated again from obviously from a base salary, and these are the two areas that we know, both in public and private sectors, have created a number of problems. As we have seen examples in both the private and public sectors over the last few years. When we don't have full disclosure coming in this particular area. So it is my hope that, again, law amendments will provide an opportunity for us to take a look at this. One of the areas that the minister has talked about is that it will not include fee-for-service physicians, and in my view, it should not. It should not include fee-for-service physicians, as we know, they have a whole range of expenses that the gross salary does no accounting for, and so I'm pleased that at this point the fee-for-service physicians are not included. And as I said, should not be included. And however, it allows the minister to define them in coverage of this bill at a later date. At least that's the way we read into this bill as it is currently written. Other provinces, of course, as has been pointed out, Ontario, Manitoba, and BC have moved forward on this legislation. They have used different thresholds for disclosing the amount of compensation that their public sector employees receive. And the bill does outline some of the compensation areas, such as overtime, retirements, severance payment, lump sum payments, vacation payouts. And the list goes as far as even payments for memberships in recreational clubs or organizations. However, again, not covering the totality of expenses that could be incurred by a public sector employee. So during the course of this bill moving through the legislative process, I do look forward to hearing from those most affected. And that, of course, will be when this bill moves on to law amendments. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I take my place.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I will start out by saying that we in this corner of the House see no reason why we wouldn't pass this bill. I look at the private sector. If you have shares in a company, you will often get mailed a copy of the annual report to shareholders, and you get knowledge of what the board of directors, and in some cases what management is making in terms of salary and bonus and stock options. And in these case of these organizations we're talking about today, Mr. Speaker, the shareholder is the general public, because we all have a stake in these organizations and they all receive government funding. So we see no reason why we wouldn't be supportive of this. Transparency is a good thing, and I think it will also help to ensure that the taxpayers' dollars are respected in these organizations and that there are not exorbitant salaries or bonuses being paid out. So from what we have seen of this, it appears fine. I know my honourable colleague had just referenced that not all forms of compensation are included under the legislation, but perhaps the minister could clarify that in his closing comments. So, Mr. Speaker, I will not take too much more time than that. I think the goal here is to ensure that organizations who are receiving public funds are respecting the dollars they have and not paying out exorbitant amounts. And we are supportive of that. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly generally echo the colleagues of the two previous speakers and the minister largely on this, in the importance of this and in supporting it. But I did want to raise some questions that I'm hopeful that the minister will be able to answer, if not today, as this process goes forward. I think we all support the idea of greater transparency. I think we've seen an example in the past couple of weeks of where such disclosure is important. But there are certainly some questions, and one of them is around the $100,000 mark. And I heard the media report claim that the minister suggested that it may put an undue burden on some organizations to have to report salaries and compensation lower than that. I'm not sure if that's what he said, but that's what he's reported as having said. However, I think that there may be merit in looking at the possibility of matching.
Order, please. The honourable member from Dartmouth East has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there may be merit in matching the civil service regulations, and one of the reasons for that is because by putting the amount at $100,000, does that inadvertently say that we think that $100,000 is too high a salary or an obscene salary just by virtue of it being that magical six-figure salary? And whereas by having it as the Civil Service Act at 25 or some other number, then we're saying that really in principle we're saying that if it's public money, then there should be public disclosure. And I'm not sure, and maybe 100,000 is the right place to start, but I'm not convinced that there's a different burden if you have to go through and calculate the cost of payments and living benefits, long-term incentive plans. By the time an organization has gone through and calculated all those, they're probably going to have to calculate the value of those for all employees anyways to know which ones will find their total compensation over 100,000 anyway. And so I just wonder how much extra work that would be. The minister has also talked about organizations that don't have a website, and it makes me wonder why the province wouldn't simply make space available on the, maybe it's the Department of Finance website as the repository for such information. And as a model, I would point towards Revenue Canada's website for nonprofits, where you can search for any nonprofit organization, and they have to list their top 10 salaries of the organization, regardless of how much it is. Even if the top salaries are $10,000 a year, they actually have to list those. and that's often a very interesting site to go through because it details, obviously, for charitable tax purposes, the amounts that are defined. And so I think that we need to understand why it is that we're doing this and whether the limits are in the correct place for that. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that the minister talked about was in his remarks was the possibility of non-profit organizations which receive a large amount of public financing. And I'm inclined on the surface, having not heard anybody object to this, that it sounds like a reasonable idea that such organizations would be defined by regulation as public sector bodies and have to report. But I think that what troubles me is we're looking at a bill where we don't have the regulations or draft regulations, and so it's not clear how that's going to be defined. And that's where it's very challenging for me is I think there is merit in having many of these nonprofit organizations report, just as the charitable ones have to do for Revenue Canada purposes on the federal website. But I think that having more understanding as we go through this process, and certainly before it passes third reading, of where the minister intends to go in terms of nonprofit organizations would be useful not only to us, but also nonprofit organizations that are wondering whether they're going to be covered by this bill. Likewise, it often comes back to municipalities, and I think we all know that there are certain municipalities in the province that are reluctant to disclose any salaries of any value other than the elected officials, and that's been an issue in the past few months in particular in a couple regions of the province where the public wants to know. And so I assume that I haven't read the definition, Mr. Speaker, in the Finance Act for a government reporting agent or enterprise, I think is the E on the end of that. But I would be interested to know from the minister whether municipalities and school boards would automatically be included as a government reporting enterprise for the purpose of this act. Because I think that if they're not, then they should, and the minister should also make the commitment that, like universities, municipalities and school boards would equally be covered by this act. I'm sure, I have to believe that's probably the intent of the minister, but I would like some confirmation on that as well. The final issue I would like to address is the one of doctors. I know the minister, I thank the minister for clarity on the issue of doctors and what his intent is. What I think we would like to know is, especially fee-for-service doctors, and I'll state right up front, my brother is a family physician in Truro, and I know that the fee-for-service payments they get also go towards covering the overhead that covers the rent, the receptionist, all kinds of things. So it's not all salary. And sometimes what we can have happen in the reporting of any compensation is if that compensation also includes the overhead costs, then the salary or the compensation can actually look much higher than it really is. And so for organizations like that, and particularly fee-for-service doctors, I'm interested to know if the minister has thought about how he would address that issue so that a doctor who it may show that he's getting $300,000 or $400,000 in fee-for-service payments, but in fact his take-home pay may be under $100,000 in some communities by the time that he's paid the overhead costs and so forth. And likewise on that, there are many doctors who have moved towards incorporation, and the question is whether an incorporated physician is considered an individual for the purpose of the reporting here, or whether they're considered a business. And I realize that may be semantics at this point, that may be gray areas, but I would like some confidence from the minister that those issues have been thought of and that there is a plan going forward. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly supportive of this moving through to second reading, and I hope as the process moves forward that the minister will be able to give some more detail on some of those semantic issues that I think could actually impact in the way this bill is reported. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I recognize the minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank all members for their interventions. I will study answer to see if there are questions I can answer or ideas that I can bring forward. And of course, as always, I look forward to any interventions at the Law Amendments Committee Thank you to all members for engaging in the debate. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would move second reading of Bill 115.
The motion before the House is for second reading of Bill 115, the Public Sector Compensation Disclosure Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried.
Bill number 115, an act respecting the public disclosure of compensation in the public sector.
Order this bill be referred to the Committee of Law Amendments. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 118, the Public Interest Disclosure of Wrongdoing Act?
Bill number 118, the Public Interest Disclosure of Wrongdoing Act. The Honourable, the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm rising today to move second reading of an act to promote public interest disclosure of wrongdoing. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to give my friends opposite a choice. I can either read this prepared statement or I can sit down and we can debate the bill. I don't know what their pleasure is, or I can bore you with my boring speech.
Is ready for the question?
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I'm full sail now. But just stop me at any time when you're really bored. Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, I was pleased to introduce this new piece of legislation that will bring more accountability to this government. Speaker, I expect all members of the House of Assembly will be pleased to hear that this legislation will also benefit all provincial government employees. Mr. Speaker, I was truly thankful that Mr. Dwight Bishop, the Ombudsman for our province, was kind enough to take time from his hectic schedule to attend this very important bill briefing. I would like to take a moment to thank Mr. Bishop and his staff for their time and indeed guidance and input on this bill. A bill, Mr. Speaker, that my colleagues and I have been strong advocates for quite some time, because we know how important it is for employees to feel safe reporting a workplace incident or wrongdoing. The Act, Mr. Speaker, is about providing a supportive, respectful environment for government employees. It's critical for our employees to know they can freely come forward with concerns about potential wrongdoings. Speaker, government is working hand in hand with civil servants and their representatives to make this happen. The Act is a great step forward in this process. And when I introduced this bill, I was asked if I was worried it would generate a lot of complaints. My answer, quite simply, Mr. Speaker, is no. I'm not worried about that. This legislation is being introduced to ensure that there is a wrongdoing, and I stress the word if, that employees are protected should they feel the need to come forward. Since June 09, my colleagues and I have been keeping our promise of putting the legislature back to work. So one of the best ways to ensure that government is open and accountable for its actions is to create a climate where those who report wrongdoings are free from reprisal. We don't want people to be afraid to speak up, Mr. Speaker. We want employees to feel safe. A clear process is needed to protect people. That's why we introduced this piece of legislation. It will ensure employees can bring forward wrongdoing in a safe environment, and it will ensure that employees are protected if such situations occur. And again, Mr. Speaker, I emphasize if. Speaker, we are working to ensure employees are confident in three things if they come forward with potential wrongdoing. We want them to know that their complaint will be taken seriously, it will be investigated fairly, and it will be responded to appropriately. Mr. Speaker, the Public Interest Disclosure of Wrongdoing Act applies to all provincial government employees. It means no reprisal can be taken against a provincial government employee who reports a potential wrongdoing under this Act. It means, Mr. Speaker, that deputy ministers will prepare an annual report of disclosures from their department and make it available to the public. Mr. Speaker, it also means that our Ombudsman will table an annual report of disclosures in this very House on this very floor, Mr. Speaker. We will also be permitted to report to the public on a matter that, he also will be permitted to report directly to the public on a matter that he deems to be in the public's interest. Just as important as it is to protect the individual who is being complained about if the allegations turn out to be false. Since 04, when the disclosure of wrongdoing policy and regulations took effect, there have been about 80 complaints and inquiries. There have been 3 findings of wrongdoing in the last 6 years. Acts of wrongdoing include breaking the law related to one's job, misusing public funds, and committing an act that puts the life, health, and safety of the public or environment at risk. Some may wonder why we are introducing legislation when we have a policy and regulations in place. The answer to that question is simple, Mr. Speaker. Our legislation provides greater protection for employees, and it shows that we are serious about keeping people safe in the workplace. For example, it puts in place an avenue for employees to approach an independent body should they experience any consequences after coming forward. Our legislation also ensures that all investigations under the Act are fair to all involved. The legislation also provides the Ombudsman with the same powers he has under the Ombudsman's Act. Speaker, we have long recognized the need to make changes and do things differently to protect government employees. Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick, the only other provinces that have disclosure legislation in place, and I am so very pleased for Nova Scotia to join them, Mr. Speaker. We are also confident the Act to promote public interest disclosure of wrongdoing is key to maintaining an honest and accountable civil service, a civil service that honors the public service and its values. We're working to ensure Nova Scotians continue to be served by a professional and accountable civil service that is worthy of the public's interest, and that these professionals have a clear process to bring forward wrongdoing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Riveting. Riveting.
The Honourable, the member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and speak on this Bill 118. I think it's an important bill. It's better known, I guess, around other circles as, instead of the Public Interest Disclosure of Wrongdoing Act, as a Whistleblower Act. And when you look at the Act, it's very, very similar to the policy that's already in the Human Resources Management Manual, Policy 14.1, titled Disclosure of Wrongdoing Policy. Now, I have some issues with the present bill. I think the concept of the bill is really good. I think hopefully it will uncover some things that may be happening in the government that indeed a cabinet minister may not know about, or a deputy minister, or even a director, that they can then take corrective action and get it resolved, and hopefully prevent the loss of funds or some other activities that may not be handled properly. The problem with it is, it's the way it has to be reported in the bill. Now, it says, it states under policy 14.1, that states that a supervisor or deputy head receives a disclosure and response is sent within 30 days to the employee, and this same deputy head or supervisor has 30 days to refer to the Ombudsman. That's fine, but what happens if the supervisor or deputy head is the problem? Then you got a problem. I think that in a reporting system like this, probably it should be directly to the minister or the deputy minister, and let them handle it in a very discreet way. Because one of the problems that the people I've talked to that have uncovered difficulties in their departments and are very concerned about issues is they're afraid of being identified with the information. And if they're identified with the information, there's a possibility of repercussions with their job and their position, and indeed maybe promotions as they go forward. So that's a serious issue, and I hope that the minister has considered this, and I'm sure he has, and make provisions in the Act that indeed that can't happen, so it doesn't red circle an employee that indeed is doing the best for the province and indeed for the people of Nova Scotia. But the other thing is, Mr. Speaker, I call certain questions in this House that the Premier was quite insistent that the district health authorities become part of government policy around the report of wrongdoing. I don't see this in the bill. Hopefully the DHA will be in this process as well, and I hope that the minister will comment on this and see if he intends to put the DHAs in there. And also school boards, the same thing is there, and universities. And we can remember, particularly in HRM here, some really serious issues with the school board over the last few years, and indeed some quite aggressive action had to be taken by the former Minister of Education, which I commend her for. And indeed, I think it's helped clean up some of the problems that were relevant at that time. So I think it's important. The two biggest money spenders, I guess you want to call them that way, or the biggest departments in government are on the list of things to be protected by this whistleblower policy, or whatever the department eventually wants to call it as they move forward. But I think it has to be in a way that indeed the employee is protected, well protected, and indeed that they have job security at the end of it, and indeed a good situation that they can move forward in their careers and indeed do the things that are best for the province. And I look forward to the minister, maybe not tonight, but sometime in the future, to elaborate on that, how he intends to do that. With those few words, we will be supporting this bill. We think in the principle of the bill is very good, and we await to see law amendments and what kind of information the minister can provide us with. Thank you.
Thank you. The Honourable, the member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to stand in my place to speak to Bill number 118, an act to promote public interest disclosure of wrongdoing. And Mr. Speaker, contrary to yesterday, I would say this is indicative of the type of legislation and the types of matters that this House should be discussing. And yes, and it was a Cape Brettoner, the Deputy Premier, that brought it forward. I want to thank the Deputy Premier because I do believe this is stewardship and leadership that deals with matters that are about public confidence and, more importantly, the integrity of our public service and those who have to be held responsible and accountable for their actions on behalf of the taxpayers, but more importantly, the voters of Nova Scotia. And so, Mr. Speaker, by those basic directions, contrary to Bill 114 and last night's 1-hour dissertation, this is going to be much shorter because it's the type of things that we believe if we're spending $20,000 a day to have this House operate, these are the types of matters that Nova Scotians would want us to be talking about and Nova Scotians would want us to be dealing with, and we are. And that is a very positive reprieve from what we've been dealing with thus far with most bills. So I do want to say to the Deputy Premier and the Minister responsible for the Public Service Commission, the Progressive Conservative Caucus supports this moving forward. And if there's any interventions I know that require any amendments, that everyone's open to this, because this is not a particular matter to politicize, but it's one to strengthen the integrity of our system here in Nova Scotia. And with that, I thank the Minister for bringing it forward and thank the House for their indulgence.
Thank you. If I recognize the Minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable, the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Cape Breton North, the member for Preston, for their interventions, and I did hear what they had to say, and I appreciate it. So, Mr. Speaker, I am rising now to close debate on Bill 118.
The motion before the House is for second reading on Bill number 118, Public Interest Disclosure of Wrongdoing Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried.
Bill number 118, an act to promote public interest disclosure of wrongdoing.
Order this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 119, the Residential Tenancies Act?
Bill 119, the Residential Tenancy Act. The Honourable, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure to move second reading of Bill 119, Amendments to the Residential Tenancies Act. Mr. Speaker, the Residential Tenancies Act provides a system where tenants and landlords can resolve their differences. But sometimes, landlords and tenants cannot come to a solution on their own. Mr. Speaker, it has been far too long since changes were made to the Residential Tenancies Act, and that is why we reviewed the Act and brought it up to date with the reality that landlords and tenants now face. Mr. Speaker, we consulted with stakeholders and we listened to their concerns. These proposed changes will modernize the Act to reflect many of the changes in our society and how businesses operate. This updated act strikes a balance between the needs of landlords and tenants and brings Nova Scotia's legislation more in line with other Canadian provinces. Once these amendments are passed, landlords and tenants will have a residential tenancy system that will be more effective and more efficient. Perhaps one of the biggest proposed changes is immediate tenure for all tenants in Nova Scotia. It will mean that tenants and their families can stay in their apartments as long as they don't violate the conditions of their lease. We are also streamlining the process for landlords to collect rental arrears. The new amendments will also standardize and simplify the process for rent increases in land lease communities, or what are called mobile home parks now, and extend full rights to fixed-term lease tenants. Mr. Speaker, these amendments give Nova Scotia an updated, modern act which reflects much of what we've heard from tenants and landlords and balances their needs. Mr. Speaker, thank you.
Thank you. The member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with pleasure I rise to talk briefly on this bill, and I want to thank the minister for bringing the bill forward. It's one of those bills I think that's been long overdue, and I know in my area there's been some real serious issues around one trailer park in my riding that the minister may not be aware of, but I can tell you your staff is. And it's been an ongoing battle with the continuous rent increases, appeals, and the whole process. And indeed, no new services put in place. It's been a real battle all the time. And it's something that someday that the minister has some time, and I appreciate your offer earlier today. I can explain to you a little bit what's going on just very briefly, because I wouldn't want to go through all the details. It would take us a very long time, and I don't think that's appropriate to waste the minister's time in that way until such time as that it might be necessary. But I think at the brief review I had of this bill at this point, I think it looks very positive, quite balanced, and I know some of the landlords would be happy with the fact that there's 15 days to start action against someone who hasn't paid the rent, because you know, people think that don't have to pay the rent, but the problem is the other tenants pay the rent to make up for the one that doesn't pay. So the other tenants are the ones that suffer, not just the landlord, but the other tenants suffer. So I think it's positive that they can do this, and they can be sure that people are paying the rent, and indeed it doesn't put rents up for everybody else in the whole area, which I think is very positive. So on balance, I think it appears on the surface to be a quite balanced bill, and I know that the minister has best intentions with this bill, and I'm not here to chastise your bill in any way at this point, but we'll wait to see what happens in law amendments and what comes forward there, and we'll hopefully, if we have any questions, the minister will answer them, which I know you will, and move this forward. And with those few words, I'll take my place. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise to speak on this bill. And we look forward to hearing some more about it. We look forward to hearing. I sense there may be an active session during law amendments. I know there are a lot of these arrangements. I think there was 11,000 arrangements in the province, leasehold agreements or agreements between tenants and landlords. And I'm hoping that this bill will improve the way those relationships coexist. And I know there can be challenges sometimes between tenants and landlords. And I think anything that we do in this legislature to improve the means by which those two communities can have a productive relationship, I think that's a good thing. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude my comments with that, and I look forward to watching what comes up in law amendments and for third reading for further comment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
In the opening remarks the minister made, I'd have to concur. It's nice to see some changes coming. The government has seen fit to do an overall review. That being said, Mr. Speaker, there's some good pieces in here that we obviously the public would support, as far as the immediate tenure. I can tell you, in speaking with some landlords, however, there was some concern around giving somebody immediate tenure rather than maybe waiting for a one-year period. A lot of landlords take chances on individuals who have had some trouble tenancy, but we do have organizations out there that have taken up the front to fight for those individuals, people like Halifax Help, to mediate with the landlords. So, excuse me, I believe that the public will be very pleased with the immediate tenure. There's a couple pieces that I think will come up in law amendments from organizations and individuals who have been affected by issues that I know the minister's probably aware, issues that we would have liked to have seen, and maybe I might have missed it, but around security deposits. It's one of the biggest things that some of the legal aid lawyers have taken on the challenges in the tenancy courts and tenancy boards on behalf of tenants. Landlords pretty much now just keep the security deposits, Mr. Speaker, and the individual a lot of times is frustrated at the list of demands that are given to them and just merely give up on the battle. So I know the security deposits piece has been very important over the last 2 to 3 years for a lot of residents in apartment buildings or mobile home parks. One of the other pieces that would have been interesting to see is around repairs, Mr. Speaker. I know in a lot of the, over the last number of years, we've had a lot of, owners come in from out of province and take up ownership of a lot of the units, and they bought into a lot of the more dilapidated apartment complexes. They've gone in and they've put a good front on. But like my mother used to always say, it's what's on the inside that counts. And when a tenant isn't able to have repairs done in a timely fashion, the process is to apply, and go to the tenancy board and fight the landlord. But a lot of times what happens, Mr. Speaker, is that tenant ends up being retaliated against, because within a period of time, upon the renewal of their lease in the coming year, they're notified 3 to 4 months out that their tenancy is not going to be accepted. Now that might be able to be fought with this tenure piece, but it's still an issue. And I know other jurisdictions, such as New Brunswick, has made attempts and efforts to work with landlords. And I know that the city, if a constituent comes into my office, Mr. Speaker, what I do is I tell them to call HRM bylaw. And HRM bylaw will go in, the fire marshals will go in, and they'll check out the units to make sure that it's adequate living spaces, and then they'll put conditions on the landlord to, within time, to have proper upkeep of the units. It would have been nice to see a piece in this legislation, because I know the government has heard concerns over the last number of years in regards to that. Again, especially with some of these big multinational companies coming in. It's frustrating for tenants when they see their rents being increased $50 to $100 a year. And I know the piece around rent control is a very touchy subject, but if you look at other jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker, there's a percentage that's allowed by the landlords and provided through the government, that they are allowed to actually increase the rents. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, in this House, I've spoken many times in relations to shelter allowances through the Department of Community Services not being adequate enough, especially when these rental increases go in. So it would have been nice to see the possibility of even a percentage allowed to a landlord to raise that. Maybe not just, strictly rent control per se, but an adjusted or an allotted amount that they could actually increase in fairness. I think, again, it's a good process to have the overall evaluation. I know we're supposed to look at it as legislatures every year. I'm looking forward to hearing the demands and requests and concerns by residents at the law amendments process. So with those words, I'll take my seat.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And certainly it's a pleasure for me to speak on residential tenancies. It's Bill number 119 and the amendments to that act. And it is a very important act. In my riding of Halifax Clayton Park, I would be, I think I would be safe to say we have the highest percentage of tenants and multi-unit buildings. In my riding, out of about 13,000 households, 9,000 are in multi-unit buildings. So I'm well over, it's about 2/3 of the households that I represent and the people that I represent. So I have over the years heard many issues around tenancy and around the safety of the buildings and so on. A lot of the buildings in my area are very new. So I'm fortunate in that respect that there are primarily a lot of new construction, and therefore there isn't the issues that often come up that we'll hear from the poverty advocates around derelict buildings or buildings needing a lot of repairs. But nevertheless, there are corners of the riding where that has occurred, and I'm certainly very pleased to see some changes to the Act. My concern is again balance, and I'm sure the minister is thinking the same thing. How do we balance the rights of the landlord with those of tenants? Because you know, the vast majority of tenants are wonderful, great, you know, great people to have in there who look after the building and who pay their rent, and it is home. And one of the points I've always made is that when you're renting, that may be a choice you've made, not that you know, you may or may not be able to afford a home, but many people will choose to be in an apartment. There are advantages to that. And in our area, many families live in apartments, which is probably a surprise to other members. But when they built the new school in Clayton Park West, they actually estimated very few children coming from all of Parkland Drive, which is many apartment buildings. And they were completely wrong. And the school now has 800 kids coming to that school when it was built for about 550. The reason is that there are a lot of 2- and 3-bedroom apartments in those buildings, and families are living there because they like the area, they like the amenities in our area, and they like the school. So we have attracted a lot of families there. So I see it very much that we do need to give people some security in where they live. We need to make sure that they have that built in. Now, I have a couple of specific points, and I'm going to let the minister know that I've looked at this act, and it's got a lot of legalese in it, and I didn't have a briefing on that act. And again, it requires going back to the original act. Oh yeah, I'm not the critic for Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, and they should have invited me because I just happen to be really interested in tenancy issues.
I wonder if the honourable member would allow an introduction.
Absolutely, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the indulgence of the member for Clayton Park. I'd just like to take a moment because I'm very grateful that the Speaker has invited us to make our families welcome, to introduce to the House my daughter B, who is a student at the Nova Scotia Community College in the Tourism Management Program and has spent today working at the Tyann Summit. So anyway, so this is my daughter B. Thank you very much. Okay.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if that's the member's younger daughter or not. If it is, she may know my son because I think they went to school together at Fairview Junior High. So that's a little bit of trivia for the members of the House. But I think that's important. I wanted to go back to this bill, Bill 119, and just saying that, you know, it is, the minister said it's a major overhaul of the bill, and I know there are issues that I hope are addressed in there, and I'm going to raise some of them. A couple of them I don't see, and one of them is this. A couple of years ago, I had a bill myself before the House, which a private member's bill, which had basically two things we were aiming to accomplish. One was to decrease that security of tenure from the current 5 years, which is what it is. You have to live, and I was just beginning my talk tonight by saying I see that as people make their home in an apartment. That is, you know, it really is their home as much as a house is ours. And I wanted to make sure that people had some security living there. And the way the Act is right now with 5 years security of tenure, you don't have security. Up until 5 years, the landlord with no reason whatsoever can ask you to leave. It's not really an eviction. It's just they say, we're not going to be renewing your lease at the end. They give you 3 months notice. And they just say, we're not renewing it. And if you say, well, why not? You know, this is home and my kids go to the area school and it's so important to me to be here, they don't have to give you a reason. And they can just simply say under the law that they don't have to give a reason and you're not welcome back after the end of the lease. And so I had complaints about that and people who felt that for no reason, for no just cause, they were being asked to leave. And the bill I had brought before the House had actually used 1 year as the security of tenure time. That gave a landlord a year to get to know the tenant, to assess whether they pay on time and whether they're quiet and reliable and so on. And within that year, once that expired, the person had security of tenure. So we had, in my vision, we brought it from 5 years down to 1 year. Now, the minister's bill before us is immediate security of tenure, and I really have no objections to that in terms of the tenant's viewpoint, but as I said, it's always a balance, and the balance is, do landlords have a sufficient amount of time to determine? And what will happen possibly is that we'll have more people being denied the original the apartment in the first place. And I do have people, and I know I'd like to mention to the Minister of Community Services, it's an issue for people who are living on community services or living close to the poverty line, because when they go to apply for apartments, they're routinely denied. Because this is the landlord's opportunity to say, do I feel comfortable with that person moving in, and we're going to then have an investment in that person? Because if it doesn't work out, it's going to be a long time to have them, you know, there's quite a lengthy period of time in order to go through the residential tenancies to have them leave if in fact you run into problems. And so they are taking a risk when they sign that initial tenancy, you know, lease, when they sign the lease with a new tenant. I'm worried that if it's immediate tenure, that will make people even more cautious. I mean, it just will automatically make people more cautious about signing the lease. And therefore, I'm worried that more students and more people who are, you know, living perhaps closer to the edge in terms of their means may be denied a roof over their head in the first place. And I have talked to people in social assistance who have applied for apartments here, there, and everywhere and are just not being accepted. And it may be because they have a bad credit rating and maybe for a number of reasons. But I just raised that you know, we have to look for that balance so that we're not harming some of the people we hope to help. And if the landlords know that you have a year to prove yourself, and you know it as a tenant, that they have just 1 year and they're going to make up their mind whether they're going to renew and extend your lease, then you know, you have an incentive as well that to do your best to pay your bills on time and be a good tenant, because you want to keep that home that you're making in a community. So I'm just going to raise that, because that may be something that comes back during law amendments. And you know, I as well as other members of the House will be there, of course, listening to see what comes up out of that. But I wanted to mention, when I brought in my bill, I had looked at Ontario, and they went through about an 18-month very public consultation. I know the minister has had some consultation with poverty groups representing the tenants and with landlord groups, IPONs representing the property owners. But I just want to mention that it was a very public process for the consultation done in Ontario, right across the province. And in an area like Clayton Park or Highfield Park, or even downtown Halifax, where we have a lot of apartment buildings, it would have been good if there'd been an opportunity, even a public meeting where people could have come out to it and spoken. Because one of the things I find, and I know other members will appreciate this, it's a very different dynamic when you represent an area that is more than 50% apartments, because people are not, some people are not as grounded or not as involved. They may be students, they may be people who've moved in my area. A lot of them have moved in more recently because of the age of the apartments. And so it's a little bit harder to connect with them and to get their views. And they don't belong to big organizations. The tenants in my area would really not, by and large, fall under the category that would be represented by, say, Dow Legal Aid. They may represent a few out there, but when there's disputes, but by and large, they are not. It's not an issue of old buildings that are run down or that would have a lot of complaints. So what I'm just saying is, that it's hard to get their attention sometimes for consulting, and it would have been good if there'd been a couple of open meetings where tenants might have had the opportunity to speak, because they may raise issues that we're not aware of and that are different from those raised by the poverty advocates. So I mentioned that. Now in Ontario, after their lengthy study that they did in consultation, they also changed the security of tenure, and in fact their bill, what I found interesting was their bill actually has an itemization of the conditions or circumstances under which you can cancel the tenure. And so they were very specific. Yeah, perhaps the minister says it's in there. I didn't see it flipping through, and that was one of the things I was looking for. You know, if they cause a lot of noise, if there's a lot of disruption, if there's damage to the property, if they don't pay their rent on time. But they actually had about 8 items that would be cause for breaking the lease. And I thought that was very important. And I know even then IPONS was unhappy, and IPONS said, well, there could be another reason that's not there, you know. But I think if there is a reason beyond the ones that you'd itemize, which are obviously cover about 99% of the cases, then there's always the avenue of going to Residential Tenancies Board. But I think it's really important, and I wanted to make sure that that was in there, that again on the protection for the landlord side, that it's clear from both parties, the landlord and the tenant, that these are the conditions that would really make your tenure insecure if you break any of these rules. So that was very important to me. I note that the bill covers mobile homes as well, and again that security of tenure, when I introduced it a few years ago in my bill as a 1-year security of tenure, that actually mirrored what was in the Act for mobile homes. And I felt that if you live in an apartment building, you should have as much security of tenure as somebody in a mobile home. So that's very important to me, that they remain in lockstep, because they weren't before. There was a difference, 1 year for a mobile home, 5 years for an apartment. I felt that was wrong. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's a point that I think is really important, and I don't know if it's in the Act either, so I want to raise this.
Order, please.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. The Honourable, the member for Halifax-Clayton Park has the floor.
That's right. I'd like to have a deeper voice so everybody listened, but that's okay. That's a masculine thing. Mr. Speaker, the issue I wanted to raise was around domestic violence, and having domestic violence as a cause for a family or a woman and her children to leave an apartment. I don't know if that's there. I just mentioned the causes why a landlord would have the right to terminate the lease. But I believe it's important that if somebody's been the victim of domestic violence, that they should be able to break the lease and leave that apartment. And I think that is perfectly legitimate, because you may have to flee. And we know that we run transition houses and give some support to those transition houses. And again, I know that the Minister of Community Services would be very conscious of this. She's also the minister responsible for women. And I think that we should make that a clause. It may occasionally be a man that's in that circumstance, but I think by and large we would be talking about women and children, and that would be a very good addition to this bill if it's not there now, and I don't believe it is there now from a little discussion that I'd had. But if I'm wrong, that's good. But I hope the minister will look at that. Also, there is an issue that's come up in my riding around deposits. And it actually, the instance that I heard of first was a student who was looking at different apartments and was told by the landlord, well, give me a deposit and we'll hold that for you. She then went to a few other places and found one that was better for her, a different apartment. And when she went back to get her deposit, it was no longer available. The landlord said, well, that deposit is mine now, because I might have refused another person on the grounds of having taken the deposit. So here's a student who's out $350 or $400 through no fault of her own, because nobody said, if you give me that deposit, it's mine to keep. She didn't sign a lease, so she thought she would get it back. And I felt the same way. I think it could have happened to me too if I was looking for an apartment, because I would have thought that as long as I hadn't signed the contract, which is the lease, that I'd still be able to get the money back again. And she was quite shocked to find out she had lost that $350, which was, as you can imagine, a real blow to a young woman who's just moved to the city and trying to go to university. And I was unable to help, because the way the bill was worded, that was perfectly acceptable. acceptable. Now, again, I know the minister has the lawyers and the advisors in her department that could look and see whether that would be allowed under the current circumstance, because I think that is wrong. If they are taking the deposit and that's the rule, then they must be required to make it absolutely clear that that's just as binding for that deposit. It's not a deposit, it's a gift, really, that they have to know they're giving that money to the landlord. And if they don't come back and take the apartment, it's gone. So I would want to make sure that if it's going to be allowed, that it's absolutely perfectly clear to anybody who gives a deposit to a landlord. That did really concern me, because if you don't sign the lease, how can they really keep your money at the end of the day? But they are allowed to. Another issue is holding of security deposits, and the system at play in New Brunswick, I think, is superior to what we've had in place here. And I don't know if in the consultation the New Brunswick system, which is called the rentalsman system, was at all looked at. But the rentalsman, which is like our director of residential tenancies, actually has the power to hold all the security deposits. So when you make a security deposit, it isn't the landlord that gets to use that money as part of their working capital and just hang on to it and give it back to you at, sometimes at some considerable delay or not at all. The rentalsman holds the security deposits for all the landlords, and as long as the tenant has done what they're supposed to do, left a clean apartment that is in good shape, they get the money back. And that is how it should be. And I've talked to numerous tenants who have to fight and, really make their case that they're entitled to that money back, because it's very easy for landlords to say something is amiss. When you put the rentalsmen in charge, as they do in New Brunswick, I think the onus is on both parties to do a better job and really to be more fair to the tenant, because if you've been a good tenant, you're not responsible for the wear and tear that's normal. If you've been a tenant for 5 years, it's normal that they might want to paint or do some small repairs before the next people come in, but that's not your fault. That's ordinary wear and tear. Even in our own homes, we paint every 5 years or so, because there's ordinary wear and tear, and I don't think that should come out of a security deposit. And so I think that there should be a very careful look at whether or not there's some grounds to do that, to protect our tenants particularly, and just take that fund and keep it separately somehow through the province. The rentalsman also has the power to go in and do repairs in an apartment where there's something wrong, like broken windows and doors that don't lock and leaky roofs. If the landlord won't address it, the rentalsman can go in, do it, and then charge the owner. And that is not an issue for me in Clayton Park, has not been an issue, because, as I said, we have excellent landlords, and they are very responsible, and they really value the portfolio of buildings they have. They look after them, and they wouldn't allow that to occur. But where it does, in the places where there are really run-down homes or apartment buildings that are operating, we need to be able to protect the tenants. And in those instances, I think there should be a power to go in and fix them. When I sat on City Council, I was on some years ago, I was on their dangerous and unsightly premises. And they changed the rule that they could go in, make repairs on those unsightly and dangerous premises, and charge the owner. So it's something that could be done. And it was the same thing. If you have a boarded up, horrible looking building in your community or it's just derelict, that's demoralizing and bad for property values everywhere. So they could move in on behalf of the other citizens, the other neighbors, fix it up at least to a minimum standard, and charge the owner. I'd like to think that if a person had rented an apartment and it had some of those security or health problems, if it's got water damage and so on, that needs to be addressed. And if a landlord won't, where's our help in the Act for tenants? So I would like to mention that too. And those were just two features of the New Brunswick rentalsman system that I thought were superior to ours. When I had brought in my bill a couple of years ago, I mentioned that it included the security of tenure, which was my primary concern. But in talking to landlords, there was also, on their part, a great concern. Again, they seem sometimes to be very diametrically opposed in terms of what they each feel. Each party feels they've got a raw deal, that it's hard to be a landlord, and the tenants feel it's hard to be a tenant, and sometimes it's hard to see where the common ground is. But I had in my bill as well changed or suggested a change to the length of time it takes for a landlord when they have just cause to move on an eviction or to move towards moving a tenant out who is doing something that is wrong, either not paying or destroying the building or any number of things. Now, the minister tells me the list of what would not be allowed is in the Act. I'm just having a hard time locating it. It's a reasonable size Act, Mr. Speaker. This Act is longer than the last one I was speaking on. I was complaining about small acts that were immaterial. This one is not, so I do like to acknowledge this one has a lot more meat on the bones, is a lot more important to Nova Scotians, and that's why there will be more discussion as we go forward. And right now, I'd just like to take my seat for today and look forward to law amendments when I hope we'll hear not only from landlords, but from tenants as well. And I don't know if there's any way the minister can make it known that there's an opportunity to speak to this bill, because I'm afraid we'll only hear from that very organized group that represent people who live perhaps in derelict buildings or in slum kind of buildings. We talk about slum landlords. I don't know if that's a fair term, but you know, I know that doesn't represent the many people that live in Clayton Park. They live in good buildings, but they still have concerns around things like deposits and some of the other conditions we've talked on today. So I would really like to see if there was some way we could encourage them to come out and speak as well at law amendments. But with that, I hope the minister's made a note of the couple of other points, particularly the domestic violence. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll try to be very brief, as I understand there is some interest in the time at the moment. Mr. Speaker, I would just like to flag, you know, we've had a couple bills go through that get passed by second reading before some concerns are raised. And then we're running into it at law amendments or third reading. And just so the record shows that, you know, there are a number of very good things in this bill, and I should commend the minister on addressing some of those things, but it's one of those bills that I wonder what sort of public this would have been great to have a draft of this bill out on a website for public to comment on in advance, because, you know, already this morning as people read about this, my phone is ringing off the hook back in the constituency office, and it seemed like every hour I was getting an email from my constituency assistant from somebody concerned with one part or another in this bill, some of them tenants and some of them landlords. So often very small landlords who have had issues and are concerned about, and that's based on what they've read, you know, what they've read about it, and that information may be accurate, may not be accurate. I don't want to, you know, suggest there's something incorrect going on, but certainly when we deal with issues around tenure, and I know there's a number of small landlords in particular who have raised concerns previously that when you do have let me say, a bad tenant, it is very difficult sometimes to get rid of those tenants, and it's very difficult to get an eviction, and there's concern that some of the provisions in this Act may make that even more difficult. While it rightly addresses some of the concerns that some tenants have, it may actually make some of the challenges that small landlords have even more difficult. And you know, I've had a number of months ago, I had one in my constituency office who had actually was facing bankruptcy because of issues he had with the tenants and not being able to get rid of them, and trouble getting into residential tenancies to get the order and then having the order enforced and so forth. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to raise the issue that there certainly are questions being raised in the 24 hours or so since, I think it was this bill was introduced yesterday, but it is certainly, there are questions being raised, and those questions may be legitimate or not. But as we go forward, I hope we'll be able to put together those and see answers, and hopefully some of those people will appear at law amendments to raise their concerns, and we can understand whether they do need to be addressed. And hopefully the minister will be open to those. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I recognize the minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the honourable members for their comments. I just would like to say one thing that wasn't mentioned, and it's not mentioned in the Act, and that is that staff will be writing a plain language act to accompany this because the legalese part can be intimidating for folks. And it was mentioned that the honourable member mentioned that. So along with this, in parallel, we will have a plain language that will go along with it so that it will be easier for Nova Scotians to understand. And with that, I would close debate on Bill 119. Thank you.
Motion before the House is for second reading on Bill 119, the Residential Tenancy Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried.
Bill 119, an act to amend Chapter 401 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Residential Tenancies Act.
Order this bill be forwarded to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I call Bill 120, we're getting close to the hour of interruption. I'm going to ask for the indulgence of the House. If we go past the hour of interruption, we'll carry on with debate on the bill. Move it? Okay, Mr. Speaker, I call Bill 125, the Condominium Act. Just move it. Just move it. 120.
Bill number 120, Condominium Act.
Yes.
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
I move second reading of Bill 120.
The motion before the House is for second reading of Bill 120, the Condominium Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried.
Bill number 120, an act to amend Chapter 85 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Condominium Act.
Order this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all the speakers today that were here and respond to these bills. That concludes the government's business for today, and I will now hand it over to the House Leader, the Deputy House Leader for the Liberal Party to give us business for tomorrow. 20 seconds. Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, Mr. Speaker, okay. So we'll be.
We will just take a short breath.
We'll just idle here for a minute.
We will just take a short breath while we're waiting for the opposition leader, House Leader, to come in. So, small recess. We'll just recess for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize for the delay to the House. I had to get the numbers. Tomorrow, we will be calling Resolution 2489 and Resolution 2490, and I believe we will be meeting at noon tomorrow, till 5. 1 till 5, but we could meet noon to 5 if you want a longer question period. 1 to 5, Mr. Speaker.
The motion before the House is that we should now stand adjourned and meet together tomorrow between the hours of 1 and 5. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. We have now reached the moment of interruption, tonight's debate. Therefore, be it resolved that the Minister of Agriculture put in place a real strategy to address the needs and concerns of farmers in Nova Scotia, and it was submitted by the Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove. The Honourable the Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think Hants West, yes, Hants West. What is the cost? Of all, it's an honour to be able to have a few minutes this evening to speak to one of the most important issues before us as a province, and that is the agricultural industry. And as some of us, I guess most of us, are probably aware, Mr. Speaker, a few of us attended last week. the annual meeting, the Federation of Agriculture in Truro. Great turnout. Anxious to hear the good news, Mr. Speaker, the good news that didn't come. There was a presentation. I got an opportunity to speak as to the critic for the Liberal Party. As always, critics have that very great opportunity to speak with the farmers and to the farmers and so on, and the industry. And then the minister got up, and the minister sounded nervous, Mr. Speaker, and it was the first time in all the times I've heard him speak that there was a little bit of nerve in his voice. It sounded rather peculiar, and I thought, wow, what's this about? And he talked about a whole variety of things before he got to the point, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not sure why, and I was looking for my glossy copy of, I probably gave it to somebody, Mr. Speaker, because there wasn't much in it. I even read it twice through, one after the other, to make sure I didn't miss something. And I read and I looked at some beautiful pictures, and there are pictures down the valley, pictures up in Colchester, all kinds of pictures, beautiful. Beautiful history lesson, nice bit of geography in it as well. Well, that's all well and good, but from what I understood from talking to the people in Truro was they already knew all this. They knew about the history of agriculture in the province. They helped us. The minister hollers over to me, they helped us. I don't know who they were, but the folks that I talked to weren't part of that they group. But anyway, and still through the weekend meeting with some folks who still couldn't figure out where the rest of it was. Maybe there's more to come. Maybe that was the first edition. I don't know. Maybe there's a second edition to come. And the minister, I'm sure, will speak to that as the evening goes on here. And in great detail, I have no doubt in my mind that he'll close this up with just a banger of a speech. Again, probably the odd hollow platitude that we like to use that language here. And perhaps it'll be more than what was in that report, other than the glossy words and the fine print and so on and so forth. And I don't understand what that meant, Mr. Speaker, but I'll take that as directed to you. I'll direct my comments through you, and I better not say the other piece I was going to talk about, prettier to look at. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, what's important is that we still seem to be missing a little something when it comes to the agricultural industry. And I'm not sure why they waited and they waited. And a year ago, we were at this very same
Order,
meeting.
please. The honourable member for Hants West has the floor. If there's conversations need to take place.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and appreciate that, given this very important topic this evening. And as I was saying, I was there a year ago, Mr. Speaker, and I've been at a couple of other meetings where the minister has been, and we attend some of the local agriculture meetings and federation meetings and district ones and so on. And it's the same story, Mr. Speaker. It's, I hope to bring that, I hope to bring that, I hope to bring that. That was the language a year ago in Truro that was used. I hope to have something for us very soon by way of this 10-year strategy, and here we are 18 months in, so now it's an 8.5 year. I was teasing him about an 8-year strategy. I'll even credit him for now it's an 8.5-year strategy. And by the looks of the strategy, it's a whole lot less than that. And I hate to use the word strategy because it's not even a strategy. It talks about some great things, that we should do, but it doesn't say we will do. And I spoke in this House maybe a week ago or so, and the minister will note that he's quoting me on something, and I don't know what that was, but anyway, it doesn't matter. The minister knows full well that there's a commitment. I stood in this House a week or so ago and I spoke to this very issue. A commitment from government is needed. There did not appear, and I said I read it through twice, I didn't see any financial commitment made by way of any specific part of the industry. Now, maybe I missed something in that. Maybe the fine print. I know I wear glasses, Mr. Speaker. Maybe they need to be stronger. Maybe I missed a line or 2 or 5 or 10 of them somewhere in it. But I don't think so. From conversations I've had, I don't think I missed any lines. And like I said, I read it through just twice back to back and then again to make sure I didn't. But, I said the other day, there's a lot of gloss in it. It's a nice report. It's a beautiful looking thing and it's all shiny. But it's got no content, Mr. Speaker. And I asked at the time, I guess it was a ministerial statement of some degree perhaps, maybe not intended, but it was here on Friday morning. And the cost. We're interested to know the cost, one. But more importantly, we could have taken the cost of that and we could have put it into the farm community in some way. Now, I spoke to a farmer there, a guy who was 77 years old, and I wish I could remember his name, but I can't. On Thursday afternoon, he was from Tatamagouche, and he owned a lot of land. And he's been trying to keep it because his daughter is in the agriculture college. She wants to take over the family business, the family farm, and move into it. He's got an old homestead that's run down, and he tries to keep patching the roof up. But more importantly, with the land, he's seen this wonderful report. The land says we got lots of land. We need to keep it viable. We need to look after it. So he's cutting the bushes, and he's got this machine. Showed me pictures. He had a whole baggie full of pictures. And maybe he met with the minister and showed him. I don't know. But anyway, this fine gentleman showed me all these pictures, and it showed his machine there, an old machine. It's got a bush hog on it. And he's going around and he's bush hogging it off, and he says he could do it for minimal cost, $10 or $20 an acre, where it costs, I guess, maybe in around $1,200 an acre once you let it grow up, and you got to get an excavator in. His numbers, I'm not sure exactly what the fee would be, but considerably more. You had to hire somebody to come in and knock it all down with an excavator and then retail it and so on and so forth. Mr. Speaker, he said, I could do it for next to nothing. And I went to the government and I asked them for money to do it. He went to the Farm Loan Board, actually, and he asked them for money. And he wasn't asking for a lot of money. That was the funny part. He wanted a little bit of money to help hold that land over, to help him keep the bushes cut, so that that land would still be good to be plowed and so on, and to be cultivated and used appropriately, as we keep saying that it's good for, and promoting and wanting to do in this province. But yet they said, no, we can't do that. So now, here he is. He's trying to look after everything. 77 years old, and he's still out doing this himself. Incredible. But he's trying to keep this alive for his daughter. And maybe a granddaughter or a grandson in the future. Who knows? Mr. Speaker, but again, it's all about the commitment. We talk the talk, but the report did not walk the walk. It pointed no details.
The Holy Angels could write a better report.
The Holy Angels could probably write quite a report on the industry. Now, I'm going to credit him. It was a good little history lesson. It was 18 pages, and I know he's a former teacher. Maybe he